This is a story about what happens when people are asked to choose between their safety and their right to vote, and how engaged journalism is alive and growing in places like West Virginia. My name is Jake Wasserman, and on June 6th, I packed up my orange Honda Element and I moved 500 miles from my family home in New Jersey in the middle of the worst pandemic in a century to move to Charleston, West Virginia, a place I'd never been in my life. I was going to be the first engagement reporting fellow at the new nonprofit newsroom, Mountain State Spotlight, to work on helping the newsroom's leadership listen to their community. 4 days later, I actually lost my housing. So I packed up my car again and I drove 500 miles back. As a brand new newsroom set to launch during the pandemic, Mountain State Spotlight didn't and actually still does not have a newsroom. So I was tasked with the challenge of getting to know and listen to a community that I would never actually get to meet. After living through the spring outbreak in New York City, I knew how bad COVID-19 could get, even though the map on the day that I arrived looked like this. My fellowship concluded in late August with two community conversations. Working with my bosses, Ken Ward Jr. and Greg Moore, we convened a group of 21 West Virginians on Zoom, including environmental activists, lawyers, business leaders, a farmer, and a pastor, to name a few, to talk about the ways that news had covered the state in the past and what possibilities might exist in the future for investigative journalism. And I'd like to give a quick shout out to everyone in West Virginia who may be listening tonight. Thank you for being here. With the election looming about 3 months after this, the question was hanging in the air. How was a brand new investigative newsroom going to cover the election? Soon after the conversations, I received a tip forwarded to me from one of our participants, Betty Rivard. Betty is a retired social worker in her 70s and a longtime poll worker who was concerned about the safety of voting in person during the pandemic. She'd been sheltering in place aside from a once daily walk along the Kanawha River and was going to vote by mail in a general election for the first time ever. The problem that she noticed was that back in June, the Kanawha County clerk sent her a paper application in the mail to get her ballot. But now, in an email that she received from the Secretary of State's office, it said that she needed to apply for a ballot on a new web portal. In the primary election, 50% of voters voted by absentee ballot. Betty had a tough time getting the web portal to work and contacted Mountain State Spotlight to point out that she thought that the portal might be intentionally designed to disenfranchise older and rural voters. Federal government estimates range between 18 and 28% of West Virginia households having unreliable broadband. And actually, in September, the Wall Street Journal reported that possibly up to 50% of children in West Virginia don't have access to the internet. On the day that Betty reached out to the newsroom, the COVID map looked like this. With all of these numbers floating around in my head, I reached out to another one of our conversation participants, Julie Archer, who leads the West Virginia Citizens for Clean Elections Coalition. Since the summertime, Julie had been pressuring the state government to make common sense reforms to be able to keep people safe during the pandemic election. From Julie, I learned that county clerks were overwhelmed with the amount of paper that they needed to process in June, that the proposed solution to make voting easier from home was to create this new online portal. The problem was that the Secretary of State's office also declined to send mailers to every voter, letting them know about the change. So voters who weren't online wouldn't know that the rules had been changed. Only 2 out of West Virginia's 55 counties would be sending the absentee ballot application to every registered voter for November's election. I thought to myself at this point, what would an engagement journalist do to reach non-internet connected voters as quickly as possible? While talking with John Keefe, the social journalism design and development course instructor, about my dilemma, we realized that the simplest solution might actually be the lowest tech option, good old print newspapers. I was going to, with Julie's help, get the West Virginia Press Association to print the paper version of the ballot application and run it as an ad in all of West Virginia's weekly or daily papers, reaching around 300,000 subscribers. But unfortunately, they told me no. They were worried about how the application would scale to print and how it might end up confusing more voters than it would help without a proper educational insert accompanying it. So as my investigating continued, I got the green light from Ken Ward Jr. to publish a story in Mountain State Spotlight. Ken had taught me, in a maxim from his former boss, Ned Chilton, that the hallmark of crusading journalism is sustained outrage. In that proud West Virginia journalism tradition, I knew that if I was going to tell the story about how rules changes were affecting people's ability to vote safely, I knew that I was going to have to give people the ability to remedy that and sustain the outrage. So my low-tech solution was going to become a high-tech one when I got to work on the West Virginia ballot bot. I knew that despite spotty internet access, West Virginians still had access to cell service to send and receive text messages. Using natural language processing, I made an easy-to-text cell phone number that was available around the clock and could help people by connecting them with information about absentee voting deadlines, contact information for their county clerk's office, contact information to get help from the 866 Our Vote hotline, and the ability to report problems with voting to journalists at Electionland. On October 15th, we published the story and the bot's phone number online. The absentee ballot request deadline was coming up on October 28th, and just over half the amount of ballots sent out for the primary had been sent for the general election. I shared the story and bot information on West Virginia-specific subreddits to drive traffic, and October 26th, my story was republished by 100 Days in Appalachia, another nonprofit digital newsroom. And on the day of the first publication, the COVID map looked like this. Between October 15th and November 3rd, my story was viewed 340 times. The ballot bot exchanged 55 messages with 7 different voters in West Virginia. I set out to contact as many West Virginia voters as possible, and although I only reached 7 people, I reached 7 people! We as journalists have to remember that every vote matters, and if my service was able to help them navigate a system designed to leave people behind, then I think engagement journalism succeeded during this election. And that's not to say that this project was without faults. I had no way of knowing who the people using my bot were, and I had no way of receiving feedback from them. I launched a project without prototyping that only ran for 3 weeks. If I could go back to the drawing board, I would have made sure that the bot integrated a listening phase so I could really get an understanding of what voters needed to know how to vote safely, and I definitely would have started earlier. I think that if the hallmark of crusading journalism is sustained outrage, then the hallmark of engaged journalism is sustained listening. I wouldn't have known where to begin if I hadn't convened a group of people who cared about the future of news in their state. And I wouldn't have known who to talk to or what questions to ask if it weren't for people like Julie and Betty, who took the time to teach me about the issues when I was reporting remotely from New Jersey. Listening is our superpower as engaged journalists, and we have to wield it to empower people to make change in their own lives and in their own communities. I'm under no illusions that my project fixed voting. West Virginia law still doesn't allow for absentee voting without an excuse, ballot drop boxes, or same-day voter registration. I had the opportunity to monitor voting issues on Election Day with the Electionland project at ProPublica, and I saw firsthand how we didn't do everything that we could to make it safe to vote. Here's what the map looked like on the day of the June 9th primary. COVID-19 forced all of us to be vigilant and to make a plan to vote this year. I've been showing these maps across the presentation because I think it's crucial to the story. West Virginia's government locked down in the beginning around this time, but then became hesitant to ever regulate people's behavior again. That hesitation meant that the most vulnerable West Virginians might not have gotten to vote, or they had to risk getting sick at the polls to do so. On the day of the primary election, the map looked like this, but on the day of the general election, it looked like this. There were 80,000 fewer absentee votes cast in the general election after the rules changed from the June primary, but 23 times more COVID cases by election day. So it's my hope that engaged journalism can continue helping to safely expand that most important American right in future, more precedented times. Thank you.